I'm a philosopher. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I work on philosophy of the emotions and more recently on the placebo effect. I also do work on philosophy of social science. And I published a book in 2008 called Shame and Philosophy, which the observant among you will see is given a nod in the title. And I started working in the area of HIV and sexual health about 2 years ago, so I'm still learning very fast. And I tend to, what you're going to see here is the basis for the work I do, and then I try and collaborate usually with clinicians or activists to actually produce the outputs and conduct the research, because I'm not a social scientist and I don't have a background in HIV. So I'm going to see if this link works. Oh, by the way, you're not going to be able to read the slides as I go through them, because I didn't realise this was going to be... I think you should have had a starting pistol rather than a microphone, to be honest. This is going to be so fast. So I did post the slides to the ASSHH Facebook group this morning, and also with the ASSHH UK 2016 Twitter hashtag. I posted the slides there, so you can follow them or look at them later if you like. But anyway, as a way of framing the talk, this was on BuzzFeed about a year ago, I think. And these guys talked about their HIV status on apps like Grindr, and then took down the replies. And it's quite disturbing stuff. Really, but I'm just trying to find one here. No, I can't find it. Anyway, one of them says, are you clean, mate? And he said, yes, I had a bath just before I came out this evening. And the reason that's framing is you'll see towards the end. Okay, so here's why I think it's important to get into the below the philosophical watermark, as I say. So, the biochemical advances are, for those of us old enough to remember the TV adverts of public information films, and the kind of impending dread when society first became aware of the existence of HIV, the progress we've made, the biomedical or the biochemical progress, is quite astounding. I think, in contrast, the psychosocial progress, well, there is very little, or at least there's very little that's actually being put into practice. We're still at a stage, even in a country like the UK, where most of the psychosocial support is operated by third sector organisations. Okay, so when I say there's there's a lack of progress, that's what I mean by that. So stigma's been extensively discussed in the context of HIV. The relationship between HIV, stigma and shame, less widely discussed. To give you an idea of where this works, stigma is the object of the emotion. So emotions have objects, things they're directed at in the world. And stigma is the object of shame. So somebody experiences shame, and that's directed at something that has a sort of stigmatized symbolism for them. Okay, so the point I want to emphasise is this: it's crucial to be well versed in the philosophical discussions about human emotions and shame, and have these discussions inform one's practice, if that practice is going to be effective. Misidentifying the nature of shame would be akin to misidentifying the nature of the virus. Okay, you've got to understand the nature of the phenomenon that you want to do something about. So here are a rough overview of 5 ways in which I think shame has an impact in the treatment and care for and living with HIV. So it can prevent an individual from disclosing all the relevant facts about the sexual history to the clinician in that clinical encounter. Shame can be a motivational factor in people living with HIV taking breaks from treatment or even simply leaving treatment. Shame can prevent individuals from presenting at clinics for STI and HIV testing. Shame can prevent an individual from disclosing their HIV or STI status to new sexual partners when they otherwise might decide to do so. I'm not saying that people should. I actually don't think that there's any obligation on somebody to disclose their status. But if somebody is minded to disclose their status, they should be able to arrive at that decision rationally, unclouded by a feeling of shame, which is in response to the stigma associated with HIV. And finally, and most importantly, shame can serve to psychologically imprison people. It makes the task of living with HIV a far more negative experience than it should or needs be. So, we need to absent or mitigate shame for the purposes of good clinical treatment, good public health, and most importantly, to facilitate the emotional health of individuals. To do so, we need to understand the nature of the emotion. So do we understand it on the Jamesian model? And this is where the philosophical distinctions come in. Or on the cognitivist model, and I'll talk about these in future slides, later slides. It's generally been depicted as a characteristically cognitive emotion, but how should one understand the cognitive constituents, the things that comprise the emotion? Are there beliefs? And if so, is it belief that, propositionally structured beliefs? And the other thing I want to take out from the philosophical work on emotions is this debate within research on shame, philosophical research on shame, as to whether shame is an intrinsically autonomous or heteronomous emotion. Okay, it's heteronomous if it needs an audience to your action to instantiate shame. Okay, it's autonomous if you can just become ashamed of your own volition, as it were, without there having to be a judging audience that you've acknowledged the judgment of. So let's talk about autonomy and heteronomy first. Okay. So, to feel shame is to take oneself to be worthy of shame, and this shameworthiness can have a number of sources. If we want to say it can be heteronomous, then the shame is an acknowledgement, a taking on board of the judgments or the morally loaded perceptions of others about oneself, and in doing so, considering oneself, one's being, to be in some way evaluatively diminished. Okay. Shame can also, it seems, be autonomous, such that shame serves as a testament to a mismatch between the sense of self one assumes and seeks to project to others, your character, as it were, and the self that one considers oneself to be on reflection. So, take an example of autonomous shame. Okay. So consider the liberal who must face up to their sexism or racism when they've reflected on their subtle but they're all the same propensity to racial or gender stereotype. In this case, shame might emerge as our liberal comes to acknowledge the tension between this aspect of their character, their propensity to subtle gender or racial stereotyping, and the liberal character they had assumed and projected as theirs. I had a department that fit this bill. Shame, the emotion, can testify to this. If they're merely embarrassed, they really haven't acknowledged the true significance of the tension. This provides us with an example of autonomous shame. However, it's widely claimed to be characteristic of shame that one can experience the emotion owing to tensions that testify to mismatches between social norms, things external to the individual, on the one hand, and aspects of one's character on the other. Here, the self-evaluation that one falls short of some standard relates to a standard which transcends or exists external to the character of the specific individual. This is the kind of shame which testifies to perverse social norms, the sort of shame in evidence when one considers the shame that some rape victims experience. Here the tension has its source in the way in which social norms intersect with one's sense of self, and how this, despite one's belief about oneself, seems to impose upon one a sense of shame. This type of shame can be often accompanied by a desire to flee or hide from others, from society, that is the audience or the honour group, that has conferred upon one this shame. So think of, you know, some of the stories you get from quite traditional cultures, where a rape victim might feel shame for having brought dishonour on the family name. What's going on there is there's what we would consider a perverse set of social norms that this person is acknowledging, despite they might very well believe themselves rightly to have nothing to feel ashamed about. They've done nothing wrong. You also find this sort of shame being discussed in Primo Levi's work in The Drowned and the Saved, in the chapter on shame. Okay. So, my view is that the autonomy versus heteronomy debate actually dissolves down, because the resources where social beings were enculturated we respond to a life world which is conceptually available to us, and those concepts are public concepts. So while instances of shame can appear at first glance either autonomous or heteronomous, ultimately they have social sources. The next distinction is, in the philosophy of the emotions as general, is between this idea of whether emotions are to be considered on the Jamesian model or the cognitivist model. So the Jamesian model is, as pioneered by William James in the late 19th century, and here the emotion is awareness of the sensation or pattern changes in the autonomic nervous system, which are caused by triggers in the environment. Okay. The cognitivist approach is that the emotion is constituted by thoughts. Okay, so the thoughts are variously characterised as construals or judgments. We judged that the bear that stood before us on the path as we round the corner in the Pyrenees is a threat to our continued well-being, and that's why we're afraid, and the hair stand up on the back of our neck. So there's certain, I favour the cognitivist approach, but there's certain problems that it faces, and that's a problem of affective emotions, those emotions where they just don't seem to be accompanied by a belief in the threatening nature of the bear, as it were. Okay, and I think this fits the kind of shame that we find some people might experience at their HIV status, as it were. Okay. So I'll skip through this. So what I would argue is that it really comes down to how you want to consider the person who is the bearer of the emotion. If you're a Jamesian, then you consider them on the first of these here, the mechanistic stimulus response processor akin to a smoke alarm. Okay. If you're a traditional cognitivist, then you consider the agent of the emotion as a belief machine akin to a software programs which output contentful information. What I argued in the book is that it's really crucial that we consider the bearers of emotions as human beings, as having a history of enculturation, of having learned a language, of being integrated into a human culture. Okay, and that therefore the responses are meaning responses to the life world, not causal responses to environmental triggers. So you therefore have to have this conception of Bildung or second nature. So, why does this matter? Well, what you need, 1 minute. Okay. So why this matters is, in the case of something like the shame somebody living with HIV might feel at having been given a diagnosis, we need to try and work out how somebody might feel shame even though they believe themselves to have nothing to feel ashamed about, and rightly so. Okay, so there's two parts of it. They believe themselves to have nothing to feel ashamed about, and we would consider them to be right in believing that. So how is it that stigma and shame can be operative? And what we see is that certain framing metaphors are operative. So, for example, the thing I was trying to find on that BuzzFeed web page was somebody talking about clean, and it is one of the things that people use is this term, are you clean, when they get a test result, etc. So the framing metaphor there is sort of giving a moral tainting. Okay, so there's no sort of propositional judgment being made, but there's a sort of implicit framing metaphor that's been employed, and that transmits a sort of moral tainting of what should be an amoral or a morally neutral test result. So what we call these is zombie metaphors. So the idea being taken from cognitive linguistics, that you have these metaphors that at first glance appear like dead metaphors, but they have effects. They have structural effects in constraining the sorts of grammatical moves you can make, but they also convey meaning, and that meaning isn't conveyed by propositionally structured beliefs, but it's conveyed by these metaphors that lie in our language. And that's what produces this stigma by stealth. So the important thing about this, I'll just have to skip through this, but as I say, I posted this so you can look at this. So the consequences of this, I think, are that it's not enough to think merely in terms of psychological support when we're thinking about shame and stigma and HIV. We also have to think about political action and addressing the perverse social norms, paying attention to the language we use. Because if we focus just on the psychology of individuals, we're abdicating responsibility for those stigma and shame conveying metaphors and structures that exist in our society. So that's where it concludes. Sorry it had to be so fast.
Thank you very much, Phil. Yes. And yes to you too. We'll do it in the order of the answers going up. That's all right.
Will be answered in the order in which it was received. Thanks for that. You raised some really interesting issues, and it's always nice to see shame brought back into the picture, because I think the word stigma is used very liberally without any definition, and as somebody who studies stigma, that bothers me. But the thing that concerns me about this is that you don't seem to have any actual evidence that this is happening. And I understand philosophy. I'm married to a philosopher, which makes it very difficult because everything's always a matter of principle. But, so and I know, and I respect.
You should have married a Wittgenstein.
Wrong. Yeah, too late. But what you seem to be doing here, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I know it's the end of the day, is that what I heard was, this is possible, this can happen, therefore we're assuming that it does happen, and therefore we're assuming that it does happen in this way. And on the one hand, you seem to be saying that unless you believe something, you cannot be shamed by it.
No, I'm saying the opposite of that.
But I mean, all right, let's.
I'm precisely saying the opposite of that.
Okay, all right. So you did correct me on that one. But I mean, is there any evidence that these zombie metaphors actually impact on people? Is there any evidence that this is actually happening? Because it seems to me that you've laid out a very interesting range of possibilities, but there isn't any evidence that it's actually.
So no, I mean, look, philosophy. I mean, there is now this movement called experimental philosophy, but I think it's not worth much. But the way I do philosophy, this is why I'm working with people. The idea is to say, look, if we're thinking about emotions like shame, then there is this work on the nature of human emotions that we need to be aware of. If we're aware of this, then that gives us more nuanced tools when we go out and we actually look to see if there is evidence. So the idea then is for me to work with clinicians, with activists, and to do social research to see if these things are having an effect. That's specifically focused on the area of HIV and how these metaphors might. In terms of more sort of abstract discussions outside of work on HIV, there is some research on the way in which the effects, metaphor effects they call them, the impact they have.
Have or can have?
Well, no, I mean, they don't definitely have. No, they can have. But that's the point about enculturation, you see, in the paper, that this isn't, we're not machines. We're not like the smoke alarm, that there are these environmental triggers. So we're not just replacing, environmental triggers in the environment with conceptual metaphors, and then saying that conceptual metaphors operate on individuals in exactly the same way that an environmental trigger would. We're saying that no, individuals go through a process of enculturation, they have a second nature, and dependent on the particular sort of second nature they may have, they will be less or more susceptible to the shaming effects of these conceptual metaphors. So there may be some people that have had a certain sort of upbringing, or that are members of certain sorts of communities, that just wouldn't be susceptible to the shame that other people might be from the use of clean in that context, for example. So that's the point about saying, look, we don't just mechanistically respond to triggers in the environment. We are beings that go through a process of enculturation. We develop second natures, as well as our biological nature. We have these second natures. We exist in a space of reasons, and we're responsive to reasons, and we're responsive to a meaningfully available world. A world which is available to us conceptually. So, have I just run down the time? So.
No, I mean, it makes me intrigued though. What kind of study you might envisage to actually look at how shame is made in practice, which is kind of, I think, a little bit where you're going. Yeah.
You just ask people, do you feel ashamed by this?
Right.
I don't understand the need for trying to come in through the back door. I mean, shame is a term that people know, they can use it, they can apply it to themselves. And this notion that there's sort of these zombie quicksands lurking about, I mean, I'm sure they may be, but it just seems to me to be perhaps be a little bit more straightforward, at least in my head. Than that's.
I'm going to take us to the next question. So we have one.
Thank you. Thanks. It's a little bit related, not entirely. I also have study stigma, and for me, you seem to be equating shame and stigma as synonymous.
No, did you not? Were you not in at the start?
I was here the whole time.
Oh, right. So at the start, I said
I thought
shame takes stigma as its object. So emotions have objects, and when you analyse emotions within the cognitivist tradition, you analyse them in terms of their formal object. So one object of shame is stigma.
Okay, thanks. But you had a slide that said, I took a photo of it because it was quite interesting. It was shame can prevent an individual from disclosing. Shame can be a motivational factor for taking breaks in treatment. Shame can prevent individuals from presenting at clinics, etc. And that, in that slide, that could be synonymous with stigma, as I understand stigma. But for me, it's a little bit.
So there's a reason for that, which is that in terms of emotions having objects, the relationship is what we call an internal relationship. So one carries the other with it. So they're not separate in an analytic sense. So that might sort of speak to.
Okay, well maybe remember that when you answer my question just now. But so I actually have two questions. One is, I think by linking the two together, shame and stigma, you actually lose the politicization of stigma and actually how it's really used to marginalise people through laws that criminalise, etc., and actively cultivate social stigma against something, against HIV, against sexuality, etc. But it's a political process, and then the second part of that is that's deeply internalised, and there's an agency for individuals also in understanding, taking that on board, internalising stigma, self-stigma, and that role of the individual creation, if you like, to have that power to respond to or not to the emotion. I just wondered how that features in your framework there. Yeah,
I mean, invite me back and give me 25 minutes, and I'd be able to do the last two slides where, so that slide, for example.
Sorry, is that your answer?
Well, I thought it was easier just to let you read it, but I can.
Listen, we've probably got time for another question or comment before we have to finish because of time. So,
I mean, look. What I want to say is, look, we can have stigmatising practice. what I want to say here is we can have stigmatizing practices that are enshrined in law, okay? So if we look at something like contemporary Ukraine or Russia, and we see the new laws, and we see those laws are stigmatizing, and they have, dramatic bad consequences for sexual health and public health. But what I'm concerned to do here is say, but actually it's not enough to just focus on that, because even if we repeal those laws, and those laws were repealed a long time ago, the structural sources of stigma and shame can still reside in the language. Okay, so we might have bigoted individuals, we might have homophobes within our society, even though most laws have been repealed and we don't have homophobic laws now. But we also have this problem of, even if we didn't have the homophobes, even if we didn't have the intentional discrimination, we would still have this structural problem that's contained in these metaphors and other sort of symbols in the environment. So I agree completely, but I want to take it deeper than just laws and certain existent moral norms. I want to say, even when all those have passed into the background, there's still stigmatizing problems embedded within our language, and that's the whole point of saying they're zombie metaphors.
Okay, we have some nods, some quizzical looks, but we're out of time, unfortunately, so I'm told from the back.
Have the concluding remarks and final discussion to have, so I think we should.
Yeah, okay, so let us thank our three speakers. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Naro. Thank you yourselves.